Okay. So, Professor, welcome back. We had our conversation earlier in the day. I just really, actually, that was yesterday that we had that. It played here on Facebook and on YouTube earlier today, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to come back and answer people's questions. And one of the things that I was really excited about was our conversation. So I called Brian and said, you need to listen to this so that you can kind of get a feel for, before we get to the Q&A section, kind of a feel for what we addressed. And, like you said, you're able to listen to a little bit, at least, Brian, you've got a taste of what's in store for you. So one of the things, though, Professor, that I didn't get to do, and I should have, was to share with you the videos from last night for our convention. And what was interesting was I wrote my own speech, which we discussed a little bit yesterday, and it was released last night. I recorded it on Thursday. But a couple of other speakers went before my talk, Charlie Camosi and Leah Labresco-Sargent. So, familiar with those two?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I know them
fantastic.
both.
Yeah, and so they both went, and I made sure that their speeches were good before I uploaded them. So I knew that it was clear, but I didn't listen to the whole thing because I wanted to watch it live, just to get the full experience. And what really struck me, since we had talked earlier in the day, and just so the audience that sees this knows, like, we didn't collaborate. There was no discussion of what the topics were. I mean, obviously your topic was determined years ago when you wrote the book and published it. So that was kind of determined, but they didn't know you were going, probably, and I didn't know what they were talking about specifically, except that they knew they were addressing the American Solidarity Party convention. So kind of had a sense of, where we stood. But all of them spoke to a key word that you brought up, and I can't remember your professor's name, but you mentioned he was one of the foremost communitarian thinkers of the century. Right? Who was that?
Yeah, his name was Wilson Carey McWilliams at Rutgers University.
Okay, yeah, and every speaker spoke to that idea that, and Charlie puts it really well, and he says that, he's very much against the concept of social distancing, and that he does not like that word. He's been kind of just using physical distancing, but he says we had to go with the opposite. Now that COVID's kind of, we're opening up a little bit and seeing some problems with that even, and we see our racial tensions in the country, and he says we need to foster a culture of encounter, is what he called it. And I know that kind of resonates. And so, if people have questions, and I'm not sure how many people are here, only a couple of people here, hopefully we get some others to join. But as you're answering, I'm going to put the link to the webinar format, because I know there's people watching on Facebook. I always have a hard time trying to figure out how to do both. I need a producer, for these events, so they can feed me the questions they always pop up on Facebook, but people don't join the webinar. But I would say, if you could address, I would take the focus, because we had a really philosophical discussion about the first half of your book, which is like the heft of your book, but take it, and then since Brian's here, and that's what the rest of our journey is going to be through November, is since you have a deep, connection to that communitarian history, let's walk through that a little bit. So what are your thoughts on just the idea of communitarianism? And then I'll let Brian jump in.
Well, communitarianism, I mean, as a kind of intellectual movement, and this was prominent at the time I was going through graduate school. Thinkers that we might think of. E.J. Dionne was somebody who I think was strongly associated with it. Jean Bethke Elshtain, the late Jean Bethke Elshtain, Amitai Etzioni, who's still writing today, my teacher, Carey McWilliams, as well as another one of my teachers, Benjamin Barber. And it was in a way, in its own generation, it was a response to what those thinkers saw as the deficiencies of the liberal understanding. And we talked about this at some length yesterday, but really they identified, as I identified in my book, a kind of how to appeal to one of the thinkers we talked about yesterday, Thomas Hobbes, in a famous picture on the cover of, often on the cover of Hobbes's great book, The Leviathan. It shows an image of the state, or a representation of the state, which is it's a giant human being, the sovereign. And inside of the sovereign, or making up the sovereign, are all of the individuals. So that you could say the modern concept of politics rests on the idea that the state, that is to say, the thing that we might think is in some ways the political instantiation of the common good, is solely made up of individuals, and in particular individuals who consent to the nature of that government. And I think communitarianism, and I think also today the Solidarity Party understands that this is a really false way to understand politics. This is a false way to understand our human condition. That we are much more so than you can ever think of us merely as individuals. We are parts of, we're parts of wholes that are not reducible to the whole of the state. To use a term that was used by the 19th century corporatist thinker John Figgis, it's a community of a state is a community of communities. And I think that's in many ways, you could say, I would think at the heart of what the Solidarity Party in many ways represents. How do we think about a national community that draws its strengths from the community of communities, but also can introduce policies that are supportive of those communities, that make it up, that constitute the political entity, the state, and the government, and so forth. And again, I think going back to the 1980s, I mean, even earlier than that, I think in some ways the student movement of the 1960s, but certainly today, the growing sense that the liberal anthropology that reduces us to individuals who consent to make up the nature of the government is really a false understanding, and it is really the consequence has been a complete loss of our capacity to speak or to think about a genuine common good that transcends our individual interest.
Yeah, Brian, do you have a follow-up question for that?
Actually, I got kind of stuck on when you mentioned Carey McWilliams, because when I was at UCLA 1970, 71, I read a lot of Carey McWilliams. And,
so I just want to be clear, Brian. So Carey, you might be, I'm not sure. Are you speaking of Carey McWilliams, the editor of The Nation, or Wilson Carey McWilliams, who often went by Carey McWilliams, his son?
Okay, I'm talking about the fellow who wrote Factories in the Field.
Yeah, that was his father.
Is that the father or the son?
Yes, that is. Yeah. I studied with his son, but
okay.
I'm quite familiar with his father's work as well.
Yeah, well, I read 4 or 5 of his books. I don't know how many he wrote, but I read a bunch of them at that time, and I had taken a class, one of the very first ethnic study classes at Pasadena City College was Sociology of the Asian in America, and was introduced to his writings. And then later, I was marching in a Cesar Chavez Day thing, and started talking to the guy next to me. He happens to be mayor of a nearby town. He told me that he once lived in a house that had previously been owned by Carey McWilliams. So I'm afraid you mentioned him, and I kind of got stuck in some memories. So I'm going to pass on the question and just say, yeah, you caught my attention right there.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, his daughter, the daughter, of my teacher, the granddaughter of the Carey McWilliams that you read, now teaches at Pomona College in Claremont, California. So the tradition of great McWilliamses associated with California continues. But let me actually, without a question, let me speak to one of the things that I learned from the son, Wilson Carey McWilliams, and it's relevant to some of the discussion we were having yesterday. And one of the things that Carey wrote about, he wrote try to see if I have it in my bookshelf behind me. I can't see it right away. Oh, wait. Here it is. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Professors need props. He wrote this magisterial, it's probably in reverse because of my camera. He brought a magisterial book called The Idea of Fraternity in America, roughly 600-700 pages. And in this book, what Wilson Carey McWilliams really attempted to demonstrate was that in the American tradition, dating back to the time of its founding, there was a communitarian tradition. He called it sometimes the second voice or the alternative voice of the American tradition. And he located it in particular in the, sometimes more in the literary tradition of America. He was a great admirer of Melville, of Hawthorne, and perhaps above all of Mark Twain. And what he recognized was that there was this dominant tradition. And it's the tradition we've been speaking about, the tradition of liberalism, the tradition that stresses this idea of the self-making self. And because I have been a critic of this tradition, quite vocally a critic of this tradition, and the strand of thinking in the American tradition, I've been accused by people such as George Will, recently in a Washington Post column, of being an un-American, of being anti-American. And really what I think, one of the greatest values of reading and encountering somebody like Wilson Carey McWilliams is to encounter someone who understood, who knew this tradition deeply, and understood there was a very powerful and very present tradition of communitarian thinking, what he called the idea of fraternity, but we could call it the idea of community, that has at least as significant and longstanding a status in the American tradition as the liberal tradition. And it's really, I think, incumbent upon us now, those living today in the crisis, amid the crisis of liberalism, to tap into, to come to a deeper understanding, and to seek in a new way, in a contemporary way, to restore that tradition to its rightful place.
Yeah, I'll tell you that in my speech, anyone who saw my second speech, the vice presidential speech, I spoke of, and Professor, we talked about this. I spoke of my parents, and they're coming to this country, and when I was growing up, I had the strong feeling, and they kind of impressed upon me how little they had, and it was always kind of the way they framed it was a monetary lack of resources, any kind of like capital or material goods, and I kind of just went with that and thought through my own self growing up that they had achieved through hard work, right, and individualism, kind of that American can-do spirit, that they had achieved what they had achieved for my brother and I and our upbringing, and then kind of the comfort that they currently experience in their older age. And I realized that was false. It wasn't true, right? They didn't have material wealth, but they had strong amounts of moral capital. And coming from India, and I'm not sure if either of you understand like the way that culture is, but I mean, the communitarian aspect of that culture is extremely strong. So I've learned more recently, in recent years, that my father was an exceptional student in his small village. And everyone knew everyone else, right? Even if it was like a village of 200-300 people or whatever, but it was very, very tight knit. And so when he kind of exhibited this high level of ability to learn, families kind of got together and helped kind of my father's family get him off to private school and then go off to college, right? And so he was like out of the entire neighborhood, right? And so he didn't leave with nothing. He left with like the hopes and dreams of an entire community, and only, and my parents keep their finances pretty close to the chest. I never know what they would do, but they were sending money back to, once they started to save and we had a house and we were comfortable, a lot of money would go back. And when my wife and our kids and my brother, we went back to visit the village, I mean, he was like a legend in his village because he had remembered his village, because those connections were so strong, that it lasted like that, right? Even after 40 years or 50 years, like he just never forgot, and one of my cousins, when we were on that trip, specifically told me that it's really sad how quickly India has westernized, where now, like, so my mom was like the oldest of 8 children. My dad was the youngest of 3, but all of our extended families were, basically connected. I was always with everyone else. And now, like, everyone has one child. There's no one-child policy in India by the government. It actually is like an internalized, we don't want more than one child because it's a strain on our individual ability to do what we want, right? And I actually heard some stories saying that people were actually having their parents move out of their house so they could take over with their one child and wife, and moving their parents into retirement homes, right? Just completely unthinkable that would have been a generation earlier, you know? And so that's how quickly that liberalism of, you know, self-desire or whatever comes up. I mean, it's so powerful.
Yeah, it's striking that a course that my professor McWilliams taught almost every year was a course that focused on the philosophy of the American founding, and in particular the liberal strain in the American political tradition. It then turned to an exploration of the thought of Alexis de Tocqueville, who I count as a profound influence in my own thinking. In other words, that what Tocqueville recognized was that America had an official philosophy, which was the liberal philosophy, but it had a kind of deeply communitarian practice that existed alongside the liberal philosophy for a very long time. And that as the course developed, toward the end of the class, he assigned a succession of novels about the immigrant experience in America. And I think in a way to show us, and assuming that all of us came from some kind of different ethnic national background, whether one or several generations, was to show us that in almost every case, really arguably every case, those immigrant communities came in and continued that Tocquevillian tradition in the United States, that it didn't just die out in the 1830s, that it actually was successively renewed. My own forebears, the Irish, a story very similar to the story you're telling about India. So that over several generations, that kind of strong sense of community began to fade as people began to absorb the official philosophy, the individualistic philosophy of the United States. And you could say that in many ways we still have that renewal of immigrant communities that continue to come into the United States. But I think we really have to face facts that the powerful philosophy of liberalism always succeeds in undermining any contribution to a more communal spirit. And so we need to think, I think, a bit more systemically about how we generate and support and draw sustenance from this alternate tradition that I think Tocqueville identified, that I think the American Solidarity Party really stands for.
I'm going to agree with that because going back to high school, I got interested in the whole topic of immigration and have made it a life study. And in every case that I'm aware of, the communities that are come as communities. There's always going to be an individual, but they come as communities. They tend to be more conservative in the sense that they are traditional, community-oriented people. My teaching career, I started in the little town where Steinbeck wrote Grapes of Wrath. And it was at that point where about half of that migration was the population there, and the other half of the town was newcomers coming in from Mexico. And then I left for 25 years and came back to the exact same town, saw the families that had changed over time. And there was a constant flow coming in from one little area of Mexico. It was all Michoacan and Jalisco. And the newcomers coming in were always more community oriented. And by the third generation, fourth generation, they had lost a lot of that. And it was unfortunate. It was a very valuable thing for those people and for the other communities that I've studied. When you go back to the Japanese immigration to the United States, they almost all came from the ken around Hiroshima, because that's where the first ones came, and then they all supported their relatives coming. And so the majority of those that were in our relocation camps during the war came from Hiroshima, that one section of Japan. So it was very typical. Strong communities is how they survived the difficulties of the immigration.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I mean, I think that's totally true of, and for my parents, there's so many people in the Chicagoland area that specifically came from a small geographic region of India because they knew my parents were here and some of their extended family that we brought over. I grew up in a house. So it was my brother. It was just the two of us. My grandmother came over very early, but there was always at least one other extended family member living with us and some of their children at times. So I think at one point we had 11 people living in our house that were aunts, uncles, and then cousins, right? And so I grew up that way, you know, and thinking to myself more in recent times. I mean, it was funny how I thought I was such an individual, but I clearly I grew up in a community, you know? But like that liberal force was on me, making me think I was doing whatever I was doing on my own, you know, and it just certainly wasn't true. So, Professor, as a professor at Notre Dame, as students take your class and hear this, right? What kind of, you talk about in your book some of the critics, or whatever. Obviously, students are not going to critique the professor in that quite. They're pushed back with questions. So, what kind of questions do they ask?
Well, I guess in particular, the students who are often persuaded that the, let's say, liberal ethos in America is ultimately one that they find problematic or even disagree with. Nevertheless, they recognize they have to live in the world. They're going to have to live in this world. And their question tends to be, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live in a way that allows me to live my life with integrity? That is to say, in conformity with what I believe, but nevertheless is probably going to require some pretty significant compromises in terms of what it is I'm going to have to do. And to give you one example of this, in my classes, I talk repeatedly about I use, I think, a pretty vivid image that I find, especially for students at a place like Notre Dame, a very elite school. I find that this image distresses them, causes them some amount of self-recognition and anxiety. I say that a place like Notre Dame, or we could say, but just about any elite university, is engaged in a kind of human version of strip mining. What we do is we identify valuable resources where they might exist, where they've been scattered around the world, as a coal company will do. We go to those places and we strip that valuable resource and we send it out for processing in a place like an elite university. And when that when that processed good is completed, then we send it off into to be a valuable piece of economic material, a valuable resource that's now been processed. Now, you could say that we do this with something like coal or with petroleum and so forth, but we also do it with human beings. The difference in some ways, or maybe we could say the similarity, is that what we leave behind in the case of strip mining coal is a blighted environment, is a completely destroyed mountain or a forest. If you've seen what they've done with the tar sands, you see what we leave behind. When we do this with human beings, what we do is we leave behind in some ways a different kind of blighted landscape. What we do now is we concentrate all of the most talented people that we identify through things like SATs. We now congregate them, or they congregate because of economic necessity, in one of several cities in the nation or across the world. And they leave behind all of the towns and all of the small cities and all of the hamlets and the crossroads that they might have been found at. And so one of the things I urge my students to think about is is, and to reflect about, is what is it, what kind of human community do you see yourself joining? Not just what kind of job do you want to have, not just what kind of income do you hope to achieve, but what kind of human community do you see yourself joining? You know, in the first instance, you're going to need to be in a strong community if you want to have a family. And I urge my students to think about having a family, because what's the point of making all the money if it's in some ways not ultimately to buy a house that you can fill with other human beings? And you're not going to be able to raise a family very well without a strong supporting role to be played in the community. And so my students hear this, and they come to me often in office hours or after office hours and ask me, how can I do something like pay back the amount of debt that I have? How can I lead the life that I've been told I'm supposed to lead without living in New York City or Washington, D.C.? Now, a lot of my students end up moving to these places, but what I also have found is they do so in some way self-consciously or with a kind of intention of finding there the kind of community that it's possible to find in a city, or eventually trying to set up shop elsewhere, maybe where they came from, or maybe in a place like where they came from. But I think just to challenge the assumption that we should think of ourselves merely as economic cogs in a gigantic machine is in some ways the first step. And I would say, in addition to the philosophical questions I get, that's the most pointed and poignant question that I receive from students. And I think it's the question that we all have. What am I supposed to be doing? How am I supposed to be living my life in a way that conforms with my understanding of solidarity and the contributions I'm called to make through not just a job, but through the idea that I have a vocation?
Ryan? You have any thoughts?
One of the things that I think is interesting in the virus times that we live in is that in my own life, and my kids are scattered all over the world from Brazil to England and several states. But when we started to lock down, I actually communicated more with my kids and my grandkids. You know, we're all in one place, but we can travel by Zoom real quick, and we're spending more time with our grandkids, and that has been a real blessing. And so there's also, I think, been a movement, a number of families I've heard about who had an elderly member in a rest home have actually brought them home, said, you know, those places are not safe, let's bring them home. And so the tendency has been to respond to a worldwide disaster by rebuilding some of those communal links that had fallen to the side. And I think that's a very healthy thing to come out of the virus.
Yeah, I think, and I kind of touched on that. I have a question from Facebook audience that we kind of answered, but since you brought up the family, a very specific example, Brian, I think that you just brought up about elderly members in nursing homes. First, actually, I saw a comment earlier today that someone said, we need to, it was on Charlie's speech where he specifically addressed in COVID that we have exposed the problems of nursing homes, you know, and then the number of deaths that have occurred in nursing homes, and kind of exposed an attitude towards the elderly, especially those who maybe have disabilities in our perspective towards that. And someone said we needed to rethink the funding policies of nursing homes. And I wanted to just have a knee-jerk reaction. We just need to rethink nursing homes. That was going to be my response to that. But the question from Facebook was, how has liberalism failed the American family? And then what policies can the ASP promote to remedy the situation? That could be.
Well, I guess I'll tackle the first part of that question, and I'll let the nominee tackle the second part of that question. Although, I mean, I would have some thoughts about that. But no, it's clear that, you know, if we go back to our conversation yesterday, that if the idea of freedom that animates liberalism is the idea that I am free when I am liberated from any obstacles or constraints upon doing what I wish to do, then this is ultimately, of course, going to threaten the very basis of the family. The family is built on self-sacrificial love. I mean, it's simply that easy. it's that simple. It's not easy, but it's that simple, that the family is built on a fundamentally different ethos. It's built on a sense, it's got to be built on a multi-generational, this is the importance of talking about the elderly as well as the young here, a multi-generational commitment that spans beyond our own lifetime. And so one of the things that a family, that life in a family does, I think if a family is well constituted, just automatically does, is it fosters in the members of the family a disposition of gratitude toward the past and a sense of obligation or duty to the future, right? That rather than seeing myself as somehow an isolated self that's self-creating, I recognize that who I am and what I have inherited is the consequence of a lot of work that has gone on for generations preceding me with grandparents and great-grandparents, people I never knew, never met, whose names might even be forgotten now. There's so many generations ago. But I recognize that I'm the heir of that hard work. And that induces in me, or requires, rightly, I think, cultivates a sense of obligation, of responsibility and stewardship to the future. So among other things, a well-constituted society comprised of healthy families won't give its children debt. That will not be their inheritance. Their inheritance will be something real and tangible. It seems to me a family is built upon the idea that we don't give our children minus or negative. We seek to give our children something positive, something on the plus side. So I think you could say that liberalism has been a catastrophe for the family, and it's designed to be a catastrophe for the family because the family represents the most fundamental obstacle to my sense of freedom, to my sense of being a self-making self. And so a consequence of that, I mean, there are several obvious consequences of that. People will increasingly not get married. They won't form families. They won't have children. If they become pregnant in a condition in which they feel that this would be an obstacle on my freedom, we as a society condone and sanction the taking of those lives. And if the elderly who are weak and frail and no longer are seen as productive members of the community, these people now become expendable as well. And we can either do it through the kind of slow forgetting that takes place, sort of putting people away in elder care homes and facilities, or as they're doing increasingly in Europe, we can simply take their lives through so-called euthanasia. So what we really see is a societal-wide assault upon the family because it calls forth and requires a very fundamentally different disposition of self-sacrificial love than the idea of self-aggrandizing pride that I think undergirds the liberal self. So I would think policies for the Solidarity Party, any policy really, that would support the formation, the sustenance, the sustaining of families, and if that means some kind of a living wage for a parent that wants to stay home to take care of their own children, not to put them into some kind of child care facility, we should see that as a deeply, profoundly pro-family policy. And I would think anything that would make it more possible for families to take care of the elderly as they're unable to take care of themselves in their own homes, that would seem to me to be a profoundly pro-family policy. So I think there's probably dozens and dozens of policies that I'm sure you have all thought of that would simply just make it easier in a time and a place where everything is in some ways oriented against the family, to be supportive of those who really do want to form families, and indeed to honor those who seek to form and sustain family life.
Brian, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'm going to agree, obviously, with the comments about debt. And what we do want to be able to pass accumulated wealth to a reasonable amount to our children. I'm not in favor of protecting vast wealth against inheritance tax, because I think it needs to be plowed back into society beyond a reasonable amount. But every generation should be able to get something handed to it from the parents' generation, and it shouldn't be debt. We also, a lot of things can be done with zoning laws, For instance, when I was real small, my great-grandmother lived in a little unit behind my grandparents' house. And I was able to go back and visit with her pretty much any time that I was with my grandparents. I'd take a visit back and sit with her for a while. And that was a very rich, rewarding relationship. And she was able to live there behind my grandparents up into her 90s. And I think probably her last maybe year and a half, she was in a facility. But that's a rich tradition that can be passed over several generations. And if we can encourage mother-in-law units, and there's some of that going on. I visited a family in Seattle not long ago where they had taken in the wife's parents, but they had a separate wing of the house. They could get off by themselves. So they could have their privacy. But they were also there to be able to join in family celebrations and family meals if they wanted to, and be there to babysit. The kids in this family were a little bit older than needed babysitting, but they were there and they could participate. And the house was designed that way. The architect intentionally created a wing of the house for the grandparents. And that kind of thing can be encouraged through zoning laws and tax laws. And I think you brought up the possibility of paying a member to stay home with those that really need constant care. We wouldn't even have to give it a large wage. We could just award credits towards Social Security. You get a quarter of credit for Social Security so that whatever you have earned during your career, you're qualified to collect it. There's a lot of things like that we can do. We just have to be intentional and look for them.
Yeah, I really like that last part, Brian, about being intentional. And I think that's something that, you think it's such a simple thing, but I feel like one of the problems with liberalism is that you don't have to be intentional. It just sucks you in. You could just go through your life and you slowly get converted and become a pod person over time. I think, Patrick, we talked about, how taking words like liberty and just changing the meaning, of that word from self-governance to no governance and no obstacles to anything, doing what you want. I mean, I think that idea of, first you carefully choose what you're doing, and then you think you're choosing what you're doing, but you're not, right? The outside forces are the ones that are getting you to shop for the thing that the commercials tell you to shop for, or make the individual choices that culture wants you to make, in that sort of mode. So I think that intentionality is very, very profound, and it's super challenging. It's not like something that you can just do on your own. I think it does take a community to reorient you in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the big things, and I want to kind of take the last several minutes here to discuss this whole communitarian aspect with our kind of racial tensions that have bubbled up again in the recent times, where I see, people that it's a very liberal approach to say that I am going to be anti-racist, right, and to approach the whole the perspectives that people have, like I'm going to do my thing to fix that. Whereas I think without a communitarian approach to that, where whole chunks and sections of society are collectively moving to fix those injustices, it can't happen. Because what will happen is we'll get distracted and we'll end up right back where we were in about 6 years, where everything quiets down and someone else unfortunately dies, in whatever situation, may at the hands of police or not. And then justice bubbles up again because the individuals will lose track of this topic. No matter how passionate someone is, it's going to, if you think about COVID and how people were so tense about that, literally a month later, something else took their attention away, and so I fear as we get closer to the election that people won't remember that these two things happened. I was shocked after 9/11. For me, it was a deeply emotional time, and I didn't forget that right? I always kind of went back to that feeling of solidarity that we had. But then not a long period of time, it felt like people forgot what that moment was, you know? So I think that if you guys want to respond on kind of racial justice and a communitarian approach to that.
Well, there's short-term things, body cams on police officers, and changing some laws so that good officers are more encouraged to report bad ones, and some things like that can be put in immediately that are helpful. But when we talk about inheritance from generation to generation, our system has been designed to prevent Black Americans from getting the kind of equity that they can pass on to their kids. They don't have the freedom to purchase in neighborhoods that they would like to purchase in. And those are the neighborhoods that build equity. And when we had the housing crunch in 2007, 2008, the Black community started with less equity and they lost more of what they had. And today, the number of, or the ratio of owners to renters in the Black community is the worst it's ever been. And so one thing we can do, and it won't show up right away, but we have to make sure that the conditions that have forced the Black community into those kinds of homeowning or home renting decisions have limited them. We need to change those so that Black Americans have the same opportunity to buy and develop equity in homes that the white community has. But that's not going to show its effects right away. It'll show its effects when the current generation passes their wealth on to the next generation. And so we won't see the immediate effects, but we need to do the things now that assure that those kinds of changes come in the lifetime of the next generation.
I guess maybe I more philosophical than policy oriented, but I keep coming back to this idea that we've talked about of encounter, and it seems to me that Americans across racial lines, across class lines, lines of wealth, across lines of sort of career prospects and educational prospects, we have made ourselves strangers to each other. We have, in some ways, simply by an accumulation of choices, and in some cases, I think, as Brian has been saying, by design. Through both routes, we have made ourselves strangers to each other, and particularly in ways that isolate and shelter those who are most advantaged from a genuine encounter with those who are least advantaged. And of course, I think about the Gospels, and Christ could have preached to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he did occasionally, but you found him most often preaching with and to the least advantaged. And I think in many ways we need to think about that form of encounter, and to address it in really strenuous terms. I was just mentioning the way in which institutions like the one that I teach at, I've taught at really great schools, Princeton, Georgetown, and Notre Dame. And these institutions are part of, and they're complicit in, a system that by design absorbs out the most talented people. And this is regardless of race. I think they're making great efforts. These institutions are trying very hard to bring in people of different racial, ethnic backgrounds. But they're essentially saying that if you really want to be a member in full standing of American society, then get a degree from one of these institutions. That this is what it takes, and this is what we can contribute. And I think in this way, they're really simply making the problem worse. I think in some ways, they're actually exacerbating the divide that we see so pervasive in the country today. So I would like to think of ways, are there ways, through public policy as well as jawboning, that we increase the possibility of encounter? And I've actually heard more and more people across the political divide on both the left and the right talking about some form of mandatory community or national service as a possibility, not simply that we have needs in the armed forces for soldiers, and the generals will tell you they don't want national service. But I think for the sake of our civic fabric, it would be very important, and it might be, I suspect it would be deeply beneficial in the way that we found the integration of the armed forces to be greatly beneficial. That people, regardless if they were off to Harvard or that they were off to the local community college or they were just going to be working in the factory, would spend a couple, maybe 1 to 2 years, at least 1 year, encountering each other, right? Drawn out of their particular socioeconomic bubble and coming into contact with each other and recognizing the humanity that now it seems to me is now almost impossible to recognize when it's mediated through social media and the various forms of electronic media. And I would encourage us to think long and hard, including incentivizing institutions like mine, not simply to send our students off to London and Paris to encounter others, but to support sending them off to South Bend, 2 miles off of campus, and programs that would really encourage us to be encountering people outside of the bubble of our own class and our own status and, of course, our own race. I think unless we do that, we can pursue every policy that will attempt to equalize us economically. But I think unless there's a genuine commitment to the idea that everyone in America deserves the same break, and that we recognize ourselves in others, that those policies won't really be able to get off the ground.
All right, well, and fantastic note. I wanted to leave ourselves a little time. Brian's presidential nomination acceptance speech will be in 13 minutes, and I will take this, transfer it to you too, Patrick, and I really appreciate, again, your time coming back. That was a great follow-up, but we got really philosophical for anybody who's watching and wants to get more into the book of Why Liberalism Failed and kind of the ideas that are present in the first, I would say like 80% of the book. We discussed that in our recorded interview, and then this was a really great follow-up to, what's next and what are kind of the philosophical and practical aspects of where to go from here. So I hope to keep in touch with the professor. This was fantastic. Brian, thanks for coming. And thanks for everybody for watching. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks. I'm available to serve in your administration, so just keep me in mind.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. God bless.
Bye-bye.